Hello, I'm Patricia Harpering, Managing Editor of the Getty Vocabulary Program. And I'm here this evening in Los Angeles, to talk to you about the application of the Getty Vocabularies and CDWA and CCO. So let's just begin. I'll share my screen and get started. There we go. So this presentation that I'm delivering now is located also on the Getty site. So if you go to the Getty Vocabulary web pages and look at the training page, you'll find this presentation. So as we go through these slides this evening, if you can't read the font or you can't jot down the URL fast enough, don't worry about it. These are online and I will send you the link. Okay, our agenda this evening, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the Getty Vocabularies, talk about using the Getty Vocabularies, and then move on to CDWA and CCO. Give you an introduction, first steps in applying, and then a lightning overview of some of the key fields. The purpose and goals of this workshop. Our goal today is to introduce you to the Getty Vocabularies and CDWA and CCO cataloging guidelines, focusing on the highlights that will allow you to become familiar with the overall layout of these resources and examples of associated issues. And there are a few exercises included in the PowerPoint that I'm not going to go through with you all tonight. We don't really have time, but you might want to look at them afterwards. The purpose of this presentation is to familiarize you just with the basics. For full access to all the categories and fields, please see the online resources. And I know it's a very dense material, and at this point, the website doesn't allow good navigation through the materials as well as we would like. So please be in touch with me if you have any questions about a particular field that interests you, and I will look that up and send you the information. Also, as we start, let me note that CDWA and CCO are guidelines. They're not firm standardized rules. So it's up to you in your local environment, in your institution, to establish cataloging practice and rules that work for your collection and cataloging requirements. And I think those of you this evening probably already have cataloging rules in place and have for a long time. So maybe look at CDWA to give you some advice or new insights on certain issues. Now, if you go to the presentation online, I have all these links to additional materials on various topics. Also, you will have there a link to the full text of Introduction to Controlled Vocabularies book. Now, let me introduce you to the Getty Vocabulary Program. We have Antonio Beecroft, Jonathan Ward, Robin Johnson, and our graduate intern, Michelle Rothrock. All of us have PhDs or MAs in art history or MLIS degrees with a strong art history background. We're recognized experts in vocabulary creation and cross-trained on all the Getty vocabularies. You can contact us with your questions or comments at vocab@getty.edu. To find information on about the Getty vocabularies on our site, just go to the Getty site, and up at the top right-hand corner of almost every page, there's a search box. If you type in vocabularies, among the results will be the Getty vocabularies pages. What do we do at the Getty Vocabulary Program? Well, we're part of the Getty Research Institute, so this is our mission. And you know, the Getty vocabularies grow through contributions, and our work is to train the contributors, to process incoming contributions, many thousands per year. We have to determine, is the data compliant with standards? Is it within scope? Is it correct? And then as we vet the data, updates are published monthly by another entity at the Getty Digital. Also, the Getty Vocabulary Program does outreach and workshops and individual training. Let's start with an introduction to the Getty Vocabularies. Here's a nice picture of us, a group of us standing. The Art History Information Program is this group, and the Vocabulary Program is among these people. This is 1997 when the Getty Center first opened 25 years ago. We're celebrating our anniversary. Now the Getty Vocabulary Program is at the Research Institute, and these other entities have split off into other places. But already then, Getty was a trailblazer in committing resources to standards and vocabularies for art information. We had begun in the late 70s or early 80s. So when this picture was taken, we'd already been doing vocabularies for 20 years almost. When we began working on the vocabularies, we were basing it on the work of CIHA, on the Thesaurus Artis Universalis, which set out specifications for creating information about artists and other people, and about places that were necessary for cataloging and researching art. Getty then engaged disparate communities, including visual resources, museums, libraries, special collections, archives, and scholars. And under Getty leadership, we reached consensus on what was required to document art and what was required to create vocabularies to aid this process. And here's another picture of the vocabulary program among other colleagues, the International Terminology Working Group. And this is when we met in early 2020, just before the pandemic locked down. And in the meeting, the group I'm speaking to this evening, at least one of you was here at this meeting. So this demonstrates how over the years, the vocabularies have changed with the requirements of our core community. And these are the people we work with, the international visual arts community. And we have the shared goal to make the vocabularies more multilingual, multicultural, and inclusive. Now, you saw when I introduced you, we have a very small editorial staff, and we work primarily with one person at Getty Digital, with a few others and some consultants occasionally, but such a small group to get good contributions and publish the data. We rely upon the contributors having compatible and good quality data. Why do you need vocabularies in the first place? Well, to provide terminology to catalog, document, categorize, retrieve, and discover art information. We capture the richness of all the variant terms and contexts and co-references associated with the concepts. Now, for some users, they use vocabularies to promote consistency in assigning terms when cataloging. For other users, they use the vocabularies on the retrieval and discovery end to utilize the variant terms and other rich data. And for yet others, they use the vocabularies as lookup resources of information. Now, there are a number of features that are important about the Getty vocabularies. I won't go through all of them. You can look online to read more about them, but just briefly, it is very important that they are structured, linked vocabularies. The relationships include thesaurial relationships that I'll talk about in a minute. The vocabularies are standards compliant. They're authoritative. We always cite our sources and contributors, but the vocabularies are not authoritarian. We include a number of variant terms that you can use locally if you wish. The scope of the vocabularies is described online very carefully. And within the domain of visual arts, this is our domain, we strive to be more multilingual and multicultural and inclusive. Our target domain and traditional audience includes art and architecture, visual resources, catalogers, museums, scholars, more and more individual scholars, and the related disciplines of archaeology and conservation. We work collaboratively with the community in scholarly projects. Now, these are important features of the vocabularies. We include co-references, and we hope in future to make even more use of these. So if there is another resource that refers to the same concept, we try to make a link to that. For example, in ULAN, we have a record for Van Gogh, the artist, and Library of Congress of the US also does. So there should be a link between those two things so that if you're doing retrieval, you can gather all of this authority information and use it. The vocabularies also are unique in many ways. Most importantly, they're global in coverage within this defined domain of visual arts. We cite published sources and contributors. We allow interconnections among historical and current information. These are all things that many other vocabularies do not do. And we accommodate the ambiguous nature of art history, art historical information. Also, we're unique in allowing these complex relationships within and between vocabularies. Actually, our vocabularies are rich knowledge bases. They're not simple value vocabularies, but they're intended for research and discovery. Minimum versus rich data. Each vocabulary requires only a small set of minimum data for a contribution, but the data model allows for rich data that if is there may be exploited for research and discovery. And the vocabularies are multicultural. The Getty vocabularies live in this world of standards for data content and structure for terminology, including subject headings and controlled lists, etc. The Getty vocabularies are thesauri. They're at the bottom of the list among the more complex of the vocabularies. And here are the relationships that make them a thesaurus. For example, on the right lower side there, writa, writon, writons. These are equivalence relationships between terms that all reference the same concept. This is then in a hierarchical relationship. So writa are culinary containers, etc., in the hierarchy. And then there's a third relationship, the associative relationship. And you can define in individual case what is meant by for this associative relationship. Here we say writa are distinguished from stirrup cups and Sturzbeckers. The Getty vocabularies are compliant with a number of standards, and you can go online to see them, a list of them, but most importantly with ISO standards for vocabularies and the American NISO standards. In this diagram, you can see just at a glance the complex links between all the different vocabularies. So this is the rich data structure I spoke of. They're not simple value vocabularies. And also from here, then we link to outside resources as well. The data is structured and published in a standard way, so it can be then more interlinked and made openly accessible and shareable on the semantic web. They're excellent resources for digital art history and traditional art history as well. We then release the vocabularies again on the website to see more details, but basically the contributed data is compiled by the Getty Vocabulary Program, merged, edited, and then published, refreshed monthly under the Open Data Commons Attribution license made available. And this is in various ways. There's an online search, web services, APIs, relational tables, XML format, and LOD formats. Now, to go to our website and learn more about the vocabularies, this is the landing page. And you can find that by searching for vocabularies on the right-hand search box of any Getty page. So basically on the left hand there, the first arrow is pointing to the left-hand navigation where you can access the data releases, learn how to contribute, look at editorial guidelines and training materials. Then the other arrow is pointing to one of the headings on this page. So if you click one of those, that will take you to a page about that vocabulary and allow you to search. So here's the Art and Architecture Thesaurus, and on this page is a search box where you can search one or more terms and use Boolean operators here. Scroll or papyri is what we're looking for. Now, our goals and missions. We want to make the vocabularies more multilingual, multicultural, inclusive, also looking to diversity and equity, unbiased, anti-racist terminology, and to make them accessible. But how do we measure where we are now? One way to look at the multicultural content could be to look at the languages in the AAT, for example. So in that first pie chart at the top, we have the big wedge over on the right is in blue are the terms in English in the AAT. And we also have big wedges for Chinese and Dutch and Spanish, and French is being worked on, and other languages. So we hope to even out these wedges over time. Also, another way would be maybe in the chart below that, we're looking at the nationality and cultures in ULAM. And here, that biggest wedge over on the left, lower in orange, represents European artists. And then we have wedges for other artists. But again, we want to equal these out and have more diversity, more multicultural content. But what is our target? What are we working towards? One way we can judge that is to compare our resources with similar vocabulary resources, and also the status of scholarly literature. Are we covering all the topics that are needed? And another way is that we to judge is by seeing if we're meeting our broader aspirational goals. This slide has to do with the contributors of the Getty Vocabularies. Right now, there are around 300 institutions, consortia, and research projects that contribute. Here illustrated at the very top, a number of Getty projects contribute. Also, national documentation agencies and consortia such as the RKD, Academia Sinica of Taiwan, contribute. Image collections could include the Frick Art Reference Library in New York, etc. Art repositories contribute. Some publishers contribute, Grove Art Online, for example, and research projects. The Florentine Codex Initiative at the Getty is a contributor, and the traditional Chinese architecture project at Vanderbilt and in China is another example. Well, how do these contributors generate data for contributions? Now, in some cases, they may do research and create original data for the sole purpose of contributing. And this is true of a lot of the translation projects in Spanish and Dutch and Chinese, etc., ongoing. Or it could be that the contributor has data already in their systems. They're already collecting the data in the course of their own work. For example, repositories probably have an artist authority file, and they could map that to the Getty Vocabulary ULAN and contribute it. We receive tens or hundreds of thousands of records per year. So those were the contributors. Who are the users? Those are catalogers and researchers and developers. The Getty Vocabularies are, in fact, consistently the most used resources on the Getty Research Institute site every month. On the right-hand side, you see a map that illustrates in a typical month where the usage was all across the world. But on the pie chart above, that big wedge at the bottom taking up half the pie, those are users from the United States. So we want to, again, increase usage around the world and make the vocabularies available. The scope of the Getty Vocabularies. So we've defined this very carefully. The scope includes terms and associated rich metadata for concepts that are needed for cataloging, retrieval, and discovery of information about the visual arts and related disciplines. We don't have every term and every name in the world, but just those that are needed for this purpose. Now we have full scope descriptions of all 5 of the Getty Vocabularies, including details about what is included and what is out of scope for each, and you can find that on our website. Now let's take a look at each of the vocabularies quickly here. We'll begin with the AAT, the Art and Architecture's Thesaurus. This includes generic terms in several languages and other rich metadata about concepts. So there you'll find terms such as amphora, literati, oil paint, etc. The concepts in the AAT are arranged in these facets, associated concepts and physical attributes on the left going over towards the right with materials and objects, etc. And here's a full record of an AAT concepts for steel engravings. So I want to point out what you see in red over in the left column. There is an ID for the AAT record, and this is a unique and persistent ID that you can use to identify this record and use in your systems. Also, however, each term has its own unique ID as well within the context of this of the AAT. And these could be used if you want to link to a specific term and not necessarily the preferred term in this record. Maybe a term in a different language is what you need. In the central column there, we have associative relationships, hierarchical relationships, steel engravings are a type of intaglio prints, a type of prints, etc. On the far right, there are notes, scope notes in several languages defining what this term is. And then at the bottom, lower right, contributors and sources, published sources where we found this information. And for us, having that information is critical. Here's a view of steel engravings that circle at the bottom of the slide in its hierarchical context. So there it is under engravings and intaglio prints, etc. Also, you see there, and the arrow is a little bit higher up on the screen, that one is pointing to a term in parentheses, a word in parentheses. This is engravings, prints in parentheses, that's a qualifier, and that's stored in a separate field in the AAT, but combined for display to distinguish between homographs. Then Above that, the arrows pointing to a phrase in angled brackets, visual works by material or technique. Now those terms in angled brackets are intended, those phrases are intended to organize the thesaurus. You should not use those for indexing. But there are various subfacets and other ways that the hierarchies are arranged in the AAT. And the terms, as long as they're not in square brackets and angled brackets, can be used for indexing. Here is a look at the various terms for steel engraving in the AAT. And just to point out, if you want the singular form, you can link to that. There's the subject ID plus this ID for the term will make your link for you. Now moving on to TGN, the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. And here you'll find names and other rich contextual data about places. And we do have places of the current world, but we're focusing in development on the historical information for current cities and also for historical nations and empires, archaeological sites, lost settlements. These are places that are known from the documentation, but we don't know exactly where they were on planet Earth, and some physical features, but only as necessary for cataloging art. We don't have every place in the world in this database. The TGN is not a geographic information system. However, it does include co-references to such systems and to maps. So terms you might find in TGN could be Diospolis, the Ottoman Empire, Machu Picchu, etc. And here's a full record for a TGN for Siena, Italy, the various names on the left in different languages, and historical and modern. We have hierarchical relationships in the center column, and there are two here. All the vocabularies are polyhierarchical, so we can indicate that Siena is part of modern Italy, but also it was part of ancient Etruria. We have an associative relationship of TGN to its ally Pisa in the Middle Ages, and the right-hand column place types. These are AAT terms that define the place, inhabited place, for example, and there may be dates associated with this that was settled by the Etruscans, etc. We have latitude and longitude, notes, contributors, and at the very bottom, sources. And if you can see in red, there are some numbers, and these are links to other resources that have information about this place that are co-references that could be combined and retrieval and discovery. Moving on to ULAN, the Union List of Artist Names. Here we have names and biographical information, relationships, other rich metadata for people. Those are artists and architects, also firms, studios, repositories, and patrons who are creating or involved with art. And we may, so terms you might find in this database include Mark Rothko, Crevole Master, IM Pay and Partners, etc. Here's a full record for a ULAN entry, the printmaker Hokusai, and there are a number of names on the left side, including his various Go names he used at different points in his career. In the central column, we have the biographical information, dates, and so forth. And now you see little red boxes indicating that, in fact, ULAN, these are linked to the other vocabulary. So the roles are linked to the AAT, artist, printmaker, etc. The places where he worked and was born and died linked to TGN. We have associative relationships to his teachers and students, contributors, and down at the very bottom, sources plus links, co-references to Library of Congress and other resources. The IA, the Getty Iconography Authority, includes proper names and other metadata for iconographical narratives, religious or fictional characters, etc. So terms you might find there could be, for example, Jibalba, Shiva. Here's a sample record for Avalokiteshvara. Have several names there for this character. We have a hierarchical position in the Buddhist characters. Over on the right, we have links to the various Getty vocabularies. So we link to the AAT, Bodhisattva, for example. There are associative relationships that this entity is associated with Krishna, a note, contributors, and the sources, as well as co-references. Here we have a co-reference to the Library of Congress record for Avalokiteshvara. And if there were an entry in icon class, which is another resource for iconography, we would link to that. And finally, CONA, the Cultural Objects Name Authority. It includes titles and artist attribution and other rich metadata for works of art and architecture, including multiples also, like prints, works depicted in other works, lost works and destroyed works, works that were designed but not built. These are our focus right now. So you'll find terms such as Hagia Sophia, the Flatiron Building in New York, the Great Wave print by Hokusai. Here's a sample record from CONA, a rich full record for the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, a number of IDs for the different names for the temple. We have work types. It's a building complex and a temple, the various patrons, the location, and various other information about this record. And then down at the bottom, the contributors, the sources, and co-references to the Built Work Registry, Library of Congress, UNESCO World Heritage Center, etc. Okay, using the Getty vocabularies, just how do users access the vocabularies? They do it through the online search. They might copy and paste. The developers may have implemented the vocabularies in your cataloging system, and you can use it there. You could access the data directly using APIs, the Sparkle endpoint, and the OpenRefine vocabulary reconciliation service. And these are all defined on our website. So here are examples of the Getty vocabularies used in a record for this work of art. So up at the top, the work type controlled by AAT, the artist in the center by ULAN, AAT for the materials, ULAN for the repository, TGN for places, subject, etc. And here's, this illustrates the benefit of linking to the Getty vocabulary. So this cataloger has linked the work type hanging scroll to the AAT, and now they have the benefit of all the rich metadata and all the variant terms for hanging scrolls that they can use, that can be used in research and discovery for this work. Also, the hierarchical relationships illustrated here, hanging scrolls, so the search could grab the children, the narrow context, and use those in the search. And so on. So for ULAN, linking to Guaoji gives, now you have access to all the rich information about that artist in ULAN, or Bianliang, the place where the work was made. I have the rich names and other important information for, from TGN that you can use. So in this presentation now, I have an exercise that you can do if you would like. I'm not going to take the time to go through it here, but basically I suggest that you might want to learn about how to get comfortable using the search mechanisms online. So you could go to the AAT site and find terms to index this object. Now this is a work in the Getty Museum. It's a lidded potpourri vase, and I have some of the subject information from the record. So you could do the searches and find indexing terms, and then maybe come up with a list such as that. And I here and at the back of this presentation, I have about 10 exercises where you can look for terms, and then I lay out some of the issues that you might find. For example, in this case, the description says that this is in the form of a NEF, N-E-F, which was a type of ornamental container that was on the table at some point. So the question, is this a NEF, or is it made in the form of a NEF? So anyway, there are some subtleties and that you can go through, and these examples will help flesh out some of these issues that might be of interest to you. Now let's do a brief introduction of CDWA and CCO. So for the history of the CDWA, you can look online. I'm not going to go through everything here. Let's just briefly say it's the product of the Art Information Task Force, AITF, that met in the early 1990s. And there were representatives from the communities that provide and use art information, art historians and curators and registrars and visual resource professionals, librarians, and other information managers and technical specialists, scholars. And working together over a couple of years, they reached consensus on what should be the minimum fields and all of the additional fields used for discovery and cataloging of art information, and to disambiguate artworks from each other. And it is published online. CCO, Cataloging Cultural Objects, came about a little bit later, was published in 2006, and this is the result of consensus with another diverse group of professionals from the community that uses visual resources and artworks. Categories for the description of works of art serves as a set of guidelines for best practice. And it may also be used as a sort of conceptual framework for art information, but it doesn't really have a data model. CDWA has been mapped to and used as the basis for various cataloging systems, and in fact is the basis of our vocabulary called the Cultural Objects Name Authority, or CONA. Here's what CDWA kind of looks like online. In this diagram, just a list of fields. It's quite comprehensive. There are 540 elements and 9 core elements. So outside of the core, CDWA would advise you to look at these elements, maybe get advice or use the elements here as necessary for what is required for your collection. Now, CCO also includes rules and examples and so forth, and is in sync with CDWA. It is based on CDWA as well as the VRA core categories, and a manual to describe and document catalog artifacts and visual works. You can find it in book form and also online. And it's arranged in 116 elements arranged in these chapters. Again, 9 core elements, the same as in CDWA. And to see the comparison between CDWA and CCO and 13 other standards, you can go to this page on the Getty website, look for crosswalks. It's a metadata standards crosswalk. Now, CDWA and CCO talk about key principles for best practice. So they're both the result of a consensus reached by these committees, and so and they both intended to describe how to uniquely identify works and record information to allow scholarly research. And among the best practice, some of the highlights are: decide what is the focus of your work. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. To use cataloging rules, starting with CDWA or CCO, and then make your local rules. Use controlled terminology such as vocabularies, be consistent, use metadata standards for your underlying data structure, and consider your system. Remember that your system is going to change over the years. You'll have different systems, but hopefully your data and metadata will last forever. And so don't allow limitations of your cataloging system to cause you to distort your data if possible. Now, focusing on a few of these include the core fields, and they're listed here. And you can, and then beyond that, choose what is needed and practical for your goals, your collection, and your cataloging expertise, and also consider your target community. These resources talk about display information that is separate from indexing information. So, for example, here, this is found throughout CDWA and CCO. You might want to display date. So you can say finished circa 1810. So that's for your end user to read. It gives them a lot of information, but then you need to index that for retrieval. So maybe in this case, we decide 5 years on either side of that span is going to capture what is needed here. So the start date of 1805 and the end date of 1815 are used in retrieval, but hidden from the end users because they wouldn't understand the subtlety here. Materials might be another place where you need a phrase to describe the gouache and gold leaf on parchment, and then index those terms with the AAT to find them again. These CDWA and CCO talk about unknown and undetermined information. What do you do if you can't find the core information? It's not available. So in CDWA, there is a discussion and advice for what to do in all of the subcategories. Maybe in some cases, it's better to use a broader term rather than a narrow specific term. Maybe if there's a discrepancy between the opinions of a couple of scholars, you might want to index both possibilities and explain the controversy, or maybe you just input a default value such as undetermined or unknown. So see each individual category to see what is advised for that. But keep in mind that for the fields that are not core, you could leave the field blank or null. But remember that null values won't be displayed to the end users, and they'll probably be omitted when you transfer data. The resources also talk about what is unknown and unknowable, and this is actually a subtle but important distinction. So make sure the catalogers are not mistakenly representing a fact as if it's just unknown to the scholarly community. It's impossible to know it. It's unknowable. Sometimes information is just unavailable, but if you had more time to do the research, you could find it. And there are subtle ways to indicate that, and this is advised in CDWA. Remember that broad and correct is better than specific and wrong. So don't guess when you're filling in values for indexing, and always explain controversies and ambiguous issues. There's some advice on this. Specificity and exhaustivity are concepts that are discussed. Specificity, we've already been talking about. This is the degree of precision. Are you going to call it metal or cast iron? Campanile, specifically, or more broadly, a tower. And exhaustivity refers to the degree and depth and breadth of the terms that you might assign for a given field. So you should decide that among your catalogers, how many terms you're going to use and how much detail you go into. Is it in fact useful to index every possible applicable term? And if not, where do you draw the limit? These are things you should establish. Maybe you just want to index the most important or most prevalent characteristics, for example, in indexing the subject depicted in a work. And then finally, employ unbiased and inclusive description and indexing. This is a very important and current topic, and it's a huge topic. We do have a little bit of advice on our website, and you can see it in the presentation. The link is on this PowerPoint. A few of the issues include be respectful of Indigenous and other alternative points of view. In an encyclopedic museum where you collect from all over the world, make sure that this is set against the desire to oppose colonialist and imperialist description strategies. So you have to avoid globalization of culture because local differences are important. Okay, the first steps in applying CDWA and CCO. First, establish the focus of your record. And the group who wrote CCO in particular found this as an issue. They dealt with a lot of visual resources community, and this is a big issue. So are you creating a record for the image or for the work? Is it, and then if it's the work, which work? Is it the group of volumes in this case? Is it one volume? Is it a folio in the volume? Or maybe it's even an illumination on a page of the folio. So once you establish that, all the information in that record should reflect this classification. Also, this just illustrates always keep the image information separate from the work record information if you can. It is very common to put all the information about what is depicted in the image in the same record as the image information, and this causes confusion and makes it difficult to use in research and discovery. If you're cataloging large groups and large collections, you need to establish a process. Of course, you should first gain control, perhaps, by cataloging the large group in a general way, and then maybe return to at a later time to catalog the most important works at the item level, if you can't catalog every single work in an item on the item level. Minimum data is the next topic. Always include the core fields and elements. And here you see a list of them for this painting: catalog level, classification, work type, title, creator, creation date, subject, current location, dimensions, materials, and techniques. So these is all information that typically a repository would have about this item. And then looking at architecture, it's the same set of 9 core fields. This diagram shows the relationships between records as established in CDWA and CCO. So in the center, you have the work record, and work records can be linked to each other. And also then they can be linked to authorities for people and places and generic terms and iconography. And you could have local authorities or use the Getty Vocabularies. These are the areas covered by the Getty Vocabularies. Over on the right-hand side, you have separate records for your images and for your bibliographic resources that can be linked to the work records. Now, CDWA and CCO discuss links within a repository, which is probably what you're doing this evening. You're working just on the records, the objects that you have in your collection. But also you could use these same rules, these same concepts, if you had a project where you're linking between works in different collections. Now let's look at some of those relationships. Again, an equivalence relationship, like you saw in the vocabularies, but among here, the titles for this work. And I'll talk about titles later. That's a relationship. Hierarchical relationships might be pertinent. Here we have a set, a traveling tea service, where you have a teapot and a cup and various things that might want to catalog separately. And there is advice in these CDWA and CCO about when to create separate records. That's when each part or component or item contains enough unique information so that it would be difficult to clearly delineate this if you tried to combine multiple works, objects in the same record. And then repositories will also consider when separate records may be necessary on the basis of the materials for conservation, etc. Here's another type of hierarchical relationship, another example. Let's say maybe one of the folios in this work was cataloged separately, linking it back to the codex as a whole part relationship. And here with prints, you might have prints in a box, which are in a collection or group, and those would all be whole part relationships are covered in CDWA and CCO. Associative relationships. These are other types of relationships. So these are non-hierarchical, dependent of, copy of, etc., study of, but these should be only clear and directly related works. They should, for these links. In this case, we have a woodcut by Dürer on the left and a drawing for that woodcut on the right. So clearly there's a direct relationship between these works, and it's made here. And the terms to describe this relationship, you may find on our site the suggestion for the various types of terms for these relationships. Here's another example of associative relationships, a cup and saucer from that tea set. Maybe the museum wants to catalog them separately, and then you can link them conjuncted with maybe. Sometimes works are made to be displayed together, pendant of a terrestrial globe and celestial globe here. It might be useful to link them. But these should only be direct relationships. Here we have an example, 2 paintings by Rubens, both are the same subject, Judgment of Paris, but you should not link them directly, we would advise, because they will be retrieved together if the user wants to through the creator and depicted subject. They really don't have a direct relationship to each other. And if you start making links where there isn't the direct relationship, you can clutter your database with too many links and it will be less useful. If you're including architecture in your database, you can perhaps indicate the architectural context. So for example, the stained glass was originally in the Cathedral Rouen, and you would link those. Vocabularies are, linking to vocabularies are types of relationships. So we've talked about this already. In this case, a vase, the work type linked to the AAT, the place of creation to TGN, and the creator to Yulan. And in this case, even though it's unknown Chinese, we all do advise that you put something in that field, don't leave it blank, and there's a value for that to which you can link in Yulan. And here's an example. On the left, we have a drawing and a photograph of the same building, the case study house number 21. But let's say you don't have in your collection a record for the building that is depicted in both of these works. Now, you don't want to link directly the photograph to the drawings just because they depict the same work, but instead you could use Kona. And here we have a record for the case study house, and you could, in your subject area of your drawing and photograph record, you could link to Kona for that. Another way Kona might be useful is if you have prints. Here we have a number of prints from the Ecce Homo by Rembrandt, and you could link them to a record for the concept of this work. All the prints that were printed from this plate, for example, you could use this Kona ID to link them together, and even to the individual states if you wanted to. Now I'm going to do a lightning overview of the core fields. So this is just to give you a sense of what is in the CDWA and CCO. The information in these resources is very dense. If you have questions about individual fields, please be in touch and we'll look it up and tell you what the advice is. So starting with work type and classification. Classification is the broad scheme in which the work's placed, and work type is a very specific term to describe it. Also, catalog level is one of those core fields. It's an indication of at what level you're cataloging. Is this an item, or is it a group or a portfolio, etc.? And it is useful to include this. This is something that repositories often omit, and it is one of the core fields and very useful. So we advise it. Okay, so back to work type. Here, work type might refer to the physical form, function, or materials of the work. Here, this Hokusai print, wood cut, refers to the technique of creation. You may have multiple work types. Here for this work, we have, it was originally a set of homilies and then a second text inscribed on it is a prayer book. So these various work types refer to the form, function, materials. Some are current, some are historical. Dates might be associated with work type. Here for Hagia Sophia, it was a church and a mosque and museum. And there, for this and other work types, there might be dates that are useful for when it served this function. Now on classification, this categorizes the work into a broader scheme. And actually this differs often by the repository. What is useful in your given situation. This repository classifies it as decorative arts and furniture. So it can be an individual thing. But work type, the very specific type of work, comes from the AAT. It's a roll top desk. Moving on to titles or names. These are identifying phrases or names given to the work both in the traditional Western tradition, which are descriptive phrases talking about the iconography or what's depicted in it, but also it could just be the names of an object or architecture. I'll show you some examples. Here we have a painting. It's called Adoration of the Magi, the title in a couple of languages. This is an iconographical theme. And here I want to point out that if you have information in the title is not really searchable in any meaningful way for retrieval as far as subject matter is concerned. So if there is subject in the title, you should record that in the subject area. So here what I'm seeing in this painting at the bottom is Adoration of the Magi. But also we have the journey of the Magi up along the top, the Holy Family, horses, etc. So you would do all that in the subject area. Don't just rely on the title for access. Here's an object that doesn't really have a title per se. It's a banner stone work type, and the title is banner stone. You might want to use preferences on your titles if this is important for you. So you could say which title is preferred for this object in general, 3 peonies here. And maybe you have different languages, titles in different languages, which is preferred for each of those languages. You might have dates with the titles. This is a work of architecture, which was renamed in 2009, had other names before. And it's also true often for paintings and other works that you have former titles, and you might know the dates during which it went by that title. You should always include the artist title and repository title. Here, Chez Mondrian is the artist title. I believe it's inscribed on the work. And so we do include that. We have a descriptive title here. Now, a descriptive title is invented or written by a curator or the cataloger, and this can be very useful if the other preferred title is not descriptive in various displays. Here, interior view of a room and an open door, and it's flagged as descriptive, so we know that the artist did not assign this. It was probably the cataloger or curator. We also advise to distinguish between the inscription and the title. And I know this differs a little bit in bibliographic cataloging, but for art, we find it not very useful to always inscribe the entire inscription as a title. So in this case, the repository calls this print Chat Noir. And then there's a descriptive title, poster of a black cat for the reopening of the Chatenoir Cabaret, but we don't have the entire inscription there as a title. Instead, that is recorded in a separate field. Moving on to the creator, and these are terms linked to ULAN. So here's a simple example, the painter for this painting linked to ULAN. In this case, we don't have the individual names of the artists, but we have the Meissen Porcelain Manufactory as a corporate body linked as the creator. Maybe the hand is identified and known by an appellation, such as the Master of the Orleans Triptych. And maybe you only know the culture, you don't know the individual hand. Still, as I said, we advise do not leave this field blank, and you can link to ULAN where we have terms to index this. If there's a publisher or other person involved with the creation of the work, include those. Here we have both the artist and the publisher. And there may be roles attached to describe the nuance of these creators and roles. In this case, the creator display says Edgar Degas, who was the sculptor of a model, but this was cast after his death. So it is useful for research and just general knowledge to know that the caster of this bronze is unknown. You might include important patrons, in this case, the commissioner for this painting. It's not included in the display. Maybe you just wanted to show your users George Stubbs, but then index the commissioner. And it can become a little bit more complex here for the Taj Mahal. We know the architect, which often you don't know. For architecture, you might only know the patron. And here we know Shah Jahan as the patron. But what about the dedication and the occupants of this funerary structure? Those would be better recorded in the subject area if you can, because they don't really have to do with the creation of the work. For archival groups, you have the origin of an archival group, the administrative originator may be noted, and then attribution qualifiers. This is often the case in documenting art. You don't know for sure the creator, and there is an attribution statement. So the creator display says attributed to Samuel McIntyre. Now we advise do not enter in your authority a name, quote, attributed to Samuel McIntyre. Instead, link to Samuel McIntyre in ULAN or your authority, and then make a qualifier, add the qualifier as a separate field attributed to, and here it's controlled by the AAT. And we do have a list of attribution qualifiers online. These are coming from the ULAN, from AAT, I mean. Creation date. This is the date or range of dates associated with the creation or production. And we've talked about this before, where you have a display date such as circa 1210, and then you index it. What does that span mean? And then there below, before 952 BCE. For dates BCE, we recommend using negative numbers, but you might have another way of doing that. And here it looks at some examples. This is a simple example. I believe it's inscribed on the drawing. 1807 is the display as start and end. Here we have some little bit of nuance for explained for the end user, early to mid 20th century, and then start and end date to index that. You might have works created in stages or over time. Here is a print from the 80s or 90s, but it was the photograph was taken in 1958. So you probably want to indicate that in your record. And here we have the negative for this print. Basically, the creative process took place in 1958, but the print was made much later. You might have parts of one object that were created in different periods. Here we have the illumination from the 11th century and the binding from the 12th century. If it's pertinent, particularly, you might want to use various dating systems. For example, in this case, the title of the work is The Triumph of the Republic. So listing the date in the revolutionary calendar for display is very interesting and important, but always index in the Gregorian calendar, so all of your works may be retrieved. For a collection or group, you would use the bulk dates, inclusive dates, coverage dates, etc., using a qualifier. For location, this can mean a corporate body, such as a repository for movable works, which would be in ULAN. And then in ULAN, that repository has a geographic location. So you don't need to redundantly list that geographic location with the work because you have the repository. But for built works or monumental sculptures, etc., current location likely will be a geographic place, and that could be indexed with TGN. Here's an example where the museum is indexed with TGN, with ULAN, and the location of creation, Saint Remy, indexed with TGN. So that was the type of location is called the creation location. We have a number of terms that you can use for this type. Here in this case, discovery seemed more applicable. It was discovered here. They are apparently 100% sure it was created here. You might have additional information with location, and we put that in a note, although you could field that if necessary. For example, the coordinates for architecture might be important, the street address. Depicted subject. Now, this is a module in itself, how to assign subject terms, but just in brief here, CDWA and CCO recommend a general subject term. So one term that refers to the subject depicted in general sense. And then specific subject terms are also highly recommended, if not required, and these could be indexed with all of the Getty vocabularies. Here's an example of a young woman holding a cat. So in the title, we have her name. She can be linked to ULAN. And the cat linked to the species, linked AAT and other things. Single sitter portrait might be appropriate. Here's another example where the general subject is religion and mythology. And then for specific subject, Guanyin, you can link to the iconography authority. Here's a capital and base in Vitruvius. Architecture is the general subject, and then specific subjects. Tomb figure of a Bactrian camel is a ceremonial object. It depicts an animal, and the species can be linked, and the funerary object. Now here's extent. So for subject matter, it might be interesting or important for your collection to note where the subjects are located. For Greek vases, this is often true. You have one subject on side A and the other on side B, and so you can use the extent field for that. So that is provided, and the list of terms is extensible, and you can find it on our website. In some works, you might have texts as well as images, and you can index those as subject as well. Here, the specific subject is the mass in this work, in this volume. You might have references to design elements or the patron in the work, and those can be recorded in the subject area. For a work where the general subject is non-representational art, you could also include design elements and motifs in subject. Square, line, orange are important actually for this work by Albers. Here, the general subject is non-representational art, but really it does also represent a human figure, although it's not immediately apparent. So those can both be competing general subjects there. And the specific subjects in this case reflect interpretation of what this object is about. And this is known from the artist. In some cases, just the one general subject is all you need and all that is important. Utilitarian objects are an example, and it's already indexed as a work type viola da gamba, so you need not repeat that here. For physical characteristics, there's a list of them here: dimensions and materials, inscriptions, watermarks, typeface, marks, state, edition, facture, orientation. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them here. So we have a display for the dimensions for the end user to read, and then indexed by the value and the unit and the type. This is typical for cataloging systems, so probably you're already doing that. And then for the material and techniques display, it's called jade and nephrite for the display, and then we index both of those terms. Jade is a broader term that refers not just to nephrite, but to other stones as well. So that's why both are indexed. The display can be quite long with a number of techniques or materials listed, and then you can index those with the AAT. You might want to use other fields to distinguish what you are indexing. Maybe you want to index the techniques separately from materials if this is important to you. So this is ink on parchment. You index the ink as the medium and the parchment as the support. But maybe the binding also is important to you. So maybe Coptic binding is the technique, and the extent where that term is applicable is binding. Style and culture. So style is shorthand for style, period, group, movement, dynasty, and these are controlled by the AAT, and we have a list of terms for type. Culture in this case is French. And here's an example where the style is Yuan and the type is dynasty. And there are a couple of cultures applicable here because these were Mongol rulers in China. So both cultures might be applicable. Description, descriptive note. So this is a narrative text or prose, and so it should discuss the salient characteristics and historical significance of the work. Here in this descriptive note for this mask, it talks about the materials and how it was made and how it was used. And if there are terms in this note or concepts that are important for retrieval, you should index them in the appropriate field, for example, the materials here, because this note is not really of good use in retrieval. And then finally, information about the view. Make sure to keep those separate. We've mentioned it before, but here we have an old slide of the Sphinx. And so the record for the image talks about the size of the slide and when it was made, where the view from the exterior facing north, etc. And then the subject, the Great Sphinx, is either linked in your collection or you could link to Kona. And then there are other categories in CDWA that I'm not going to talk about here, but 540 categories. There are a lot of categories, and hopefully you can find what you need there. So thank you. That's the end of the presentation, and I'll leave time now for questions from the audience. But before that, let me just point out there are these additional exercises at the end that you might find useful. So there's an image and some information, and then you might want to look for the terms to learn how to become more familiar with the Getty vocabularies. And I want to thank you for your attention this evening. And I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you very much.